stand before Jean-François Millet's The Angelus and the Musée d'Orsay, and at first you are met with silence. It is a silence so profound it feels almost thick, hanging heavy in the air like the damp mist of an autumn evening. We see two figures, a man and a woman, standing in a vast, desolate field. The sun is setting, casting a dying, muddy light across the horizon, silhouetting their bowed forms against a pale and indifferent sky. They have paused their labor. The pitchfork stands stuck in the earth. The wheelbarrow waits. Between them, on the rough, tilled soil, sits a small basket. They are reciting the Angelus, the prayer meant to mark the end of the day's work, triggered by the distant tolling of a church bell we can almost hear faint on the wind. It is the quintessential image of peasant piety, reproduced on millions of calendars, plates, and embroidered cushions, a symbol of humble, rustic faith. But look closer. Let your eyes adjust to the gathering gloom of Millet's palette. There is something unsettling here, a frequency of distress that hums beneath the surface of this pastoral tranquility. The twilight does not feel comforting. It feels oppressive, as if the darkness is not just falling, but closing in. The figures do not stand with the relaxed weariness of workers resting. They are rigid, tense, possessing a monumental stillness that feels closer to paralysis than prayer. The woman's posture is particularly striking, hands clasped tightly over her chest, head bowed so low it seems weighed down by an invisible burden. The man twists his hat in his hands, an awkward, nervous gesture that speaks of grief rather than devotion. They are alone in a landscape that offers no shelter, no trees, no comfort, just an endless, flat expanse of brown earth that threatens to swallow them whole. It was this peculiar, vibrating anxiety that seized Salvador Dalí. While the rest of the world saw a sentimental masterpiece of rural virtue, Dalí saw a nightmare. For the Surrealist master, this painting was not a depiction of peace. It was the single most troubling, enigmatic, dense, and richest image in the history of unconscious thought. He was obsessed with it. He wrote that the painting induced in him a violent and inexplicable malaise, a feeling of deep, primal dread that he could not logically articulate. Why would a simple scene of prayer trigger such a visceral reaction? Dalí was convinced that the painting was a lie. He believed that the melancholic atmosphere was too heavy to be explained by mere exhaustion or religious solemnity. The shadows were too deep, the isolation too complete. Dalí sensed that the viewer was witnessing a scene of repression. He argued that the peaceful facade was a mask, a layer of paint applied to cover a wound that refused to heal. He looked at that basket of potatoes sitting between the couple, the focal point of their downward gaze, and he felt a chill. To him, the geometry of the scene, the triangulation of the figures, the way the light died around that specific spot on the ground, all pointed to a terrible secret. The world saw a harvest. Dalí saw a grave. He was convinced that the Angelus was not a prayer for the living, but a requiem for the dead, and that the tranquility the world admired was actually the stunned silence of parents standing over the corpse of their child. To understand how Dalí moved from a feeling of dread to a concrete theory of a hidden corpse, we must step into the labyrinth of his paranoiac-critical method. This was Dalí's primary tool for artistic creation and analysis, a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the critical and systematic objectivity of the associations and interpretations of delirious phenomena. In simpler terms, Dalí believed that by simulating a paranoid state, one could impose a subjective obsession onto the external world so forcefully that it revealed a hidden objective truth. He didn't just look at art, he interrogated it with the intensity of a fever dream, forcing the image to surrender its subconscious secrets. Dalí's fixation on the Angelus became a lifelong haunt. He didn't just write about it, he painted it over and over again, distorting Millet's figures into surreal architectural monstrosities. In his 1933 work, Archaeological Reminiscence of Millet's Angelus, the peasant couple is transformed into colossal ruined towers of brick and stone, dominating a moonlit desert. They are ancient, crumbling, and hollowed out, suggesting that the trauma they represent is as old as time itself. Here, the male figure is dominated by the female, who looms larger, more threatening. Dalí often associated the female figure in The Angelus with the praying mantis, a creature that devours its mate after copulation. He saw a terrifying sexual tension in the painting, a dynamic of predator and prey, but this sexual anxiety was inextricably linked to death. He argued that the posture of the figures was unmistakable, the way they leaned toward the center, the severe angle of their heads. This was the body language of mourning, not prayer. He wrote an entire book, The Tragic Myth of Millet's Angelus, dissecting the psychological weight of the scene. He claimed that the basket was not a basket at all. Its dimensions were wrong. Its placement was too ceremonial. It was, he insisted, a coffin, specifically a coffin for a small child. In Dalí's paranoiac vision, the potatoes were a convenient fiction, a veil drawn over the unbearable reality of infant mortality. Critics and historians largely dismissed this as classic Dalí theatrics, a provocateur projecting his own morbid obsessions onto a classic work of French realism. They sighed as a Freudian fantasy, a way for Dalí to inject his own themes of sex, death, and decay into the canon of art history. After all, Millet was known as a painter of peasant life, a chronicler of the rhythm of the seasons, not a dark symbolist hiding dead bodies in his fields. But Dalí remained unshaken. He treated his intuition as scientific fact. He spoke of the atavistic memory of the painting, as if the canvas itself held the memory of the brushstrokes that had been covered up. He insisted that the true subject of the painting was being repressed, much like a traumatic memory in the human psyche, buried deep but still radiating a palpable, ghostly influence over the conscious mind. He waited for the day when technology would catch up to his intuition, confident that the ghost he saw would eventually be made visible to the naked eye. The vindication, when it finally arrived, was absolute and chilling. In 1963, years after Dalí first voiced his disturbing theory, the Louvre agreed to subject Millet's The Angelus to an X-ray analysis. The request was driven by Dalí's relentless insistence, though few curators expected to find anything that would validate the Surrealists' wild claims. They expected to see perhaps a sketch adjustment, a shifting of a limb, or a change in the horizon line, the typical pentimenti or regrets that artists leave beneath the final layer of paint. What they found instead sent a shockwave through the art world that effectively rewrote the history of the masterpiece. The radiographic images peeled back the century-old layers of oil and varnish, revealing the ghost in the machine. There, clearly defined beneath the basket of potatoes, was a geometric box-like shape. It was dark, distinct, and unmistakably rectangular. It did not resemble a basket, a sack, or a pile of crops. It resembled a small coffin. The X-rays confirmed that Millet had originally painted a burial scene. The couple was indeed mourning a dead child, likely an unbaptized infant who could not be buried in the churchyard and thus had to be interred in the field where they worked. The geometry that Dalí had obsessively analyzed, the heaviness of the composition, the funereal atmosphere, it was all real. It wasn't a paranoiac projection, it was a residual truth bleeding through the overpaint. Historians pieced together the likely narrative. Millet, struggling for money and recognition, was advised that a painting of a dead baby would be too maudlin, too tragic, and frankly unsellable to the Parisian bourgeoisie. The 19th century art market wanted the romance of peasant life, not its brutal mortality. So Millet capitulated. He painted over the coffin, replacing the tragedy with the basket of potatoes, transforming a funeral into a prayer for the harvest. He changed the title, the narrative, and the explicit meaning of the work, but he could not, or perhaps would not, erase the emotional posture of the figures. This discovery is one of the most profound moments in the history of art analysis because it validates the power of the viewer's intuition. Dalí was right. He proved that a painting is more than just surface pigment. It is an object with a memory. The paranoiac-critical method, often dismissed as madness, had functioned as a kind of psychological X-ray. Dalí had sensed the invisible weight of the coffin through the sheer emotional resonance of the brushwork. The potatoes were indeed a mask, a lie that the canvas told to survive in the marketplace. When we look at the Angelus now, we cannot unsee the coffin. The basket becomes translucent to our mind's eye. The twilight becomes a shroud. And we realize that for over 100 years, millions of people had stared at a funeral and called it beautiful, unknowingly participating in the repression of a tragedy that refused to stay buried.